So when did you, and I might ask you these questions again tomorrow, so I apologize. When did you first meet, when did the Wackers first come from an idea into an existence?
Well, it was a very, to a certain degree, self-destructive choice. Bob and I had come out of Roxy as a duo, Segarini and Bishop, and we had just done a film called Vanishing Point in LA, and it was a very hip thing to be involved in. Delaney and Bonnie and Rita Coolidge and Kenny Rogers and a bunch of people were involved in this film. And we had an offer from David Anderle to do a duo album on A&M. And then suddenly we took Mike Stull, who also was signed to A&M, or had an offer from David to do a solo record, and we met him in Eureka, California, and we started jamming. And then we just made a noise together singing that was pretty phenomenal, and so we kind of fell in love with that idea, and we went down to a club called the Purple Haze, where Michael was the kind of local superstar, and we jammed for hours for free pitchers of beer, and that's where the Wackers started. We could have all three of us could have had deals with A&M and done our solo and duo thing, and instead we decided to work at the Purple Haze for free beer and 7 sets a night, 7 nights a week, just so we could play rock and roll. And we never rehearsed, and we started writing. Then we started writing songs together, and all this kind of new stuff was coming out that had all these great 3-part harmonies, and just grew into a sound that we really loved, we resonated with.
Nice. Can you tell me a bit about Vanishing Point? Because that very cool.
Well, we were friends with David Anderle, who had been the head of A&R for Elektra. Prior to that, he was the head of A&R for Brother Records, which was the Beach Boys record label. And David signed Delaney and Bonnie, and Kerner and Murphy, and Jackson Brown, and a bunch of people who came to the label at that point, including Roxy, the band that Bob and I were with. But then shortly thereafter, David left Elektra because he spirited away Rita Coolidge from the Delaney and Bonnie band and wanted to produce a solo record with her. So he took her to A&M, and he got himself a job there as an A&R guy, a staff producer. And but we remained friends. We were like every Sunday we'd get together and watch football games together and hang out. And so we all kept in touch, and we'd play our new songs for David, and we were doing the Troubadour Hoot Nights and as a duo, Bob and myself. And so he invited us down to the A&M lot one time just to see a screening of this movie. It had no music in it. It was very rough cut, but it was a pretty amazing. This was at the beginning of the 70s, which, you know, to a certain degree was such a seminal period of time for what are now really called independent films to get into the mainstream. I mean, there was the Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper thing. What was it called? Easy Rider. Mm-hmm. There was Easy Rider, and there were all of these very raw 70s era movies. Hal Ashby was making movies like that, but this was one of the seminal movies that kind of led into that period of time, and it was very existential and symbolic. Here was this guy who was trying to get a car from Colorado to LA in a certain amount of time on a bet, and he would do anything to win that bet. And he became notorious on FM radio people were following him, and the part was played by Barry Newman, who ended up being in a TV series called Petrocelli, and but there were really hip people involved in the soundtrack. Jimmy Bowen was the guy who was putting it together. So David Anderle called us to come down to the A&M lot to watch a screening of this movie. And when we got there, Delaney and Bonnie and Rita Coolidge and all, you know, Kenny Rogers and all these people were down there, and the guys who eventually were part of the Eagles and wrote for the Eagles. Glenn Frey and J.D. Souther were there. They had a duo called Long Branch Penny Whistle, and we used to be kind of rivals of theirs as a duo at the Troubadour on Monday Night Hoots. And so we all watched the movie, and they asked us to submit songs, and Bob and I went into like a closet at it was one of the small closets. It was a storage room with one of the engineers from Sunset Sound, and we cut 3 or 4 demos on 4-track Tascam machine or something, and 2 of them the producers of Vanishing Point decided to use in the movie, and they decided to use them in very strategic parts in the soundtrack. So that inclined David Anderle to say, hey, well, these guys are really happening, they've got this thing going on. We had 2 songs in the movie, and Glenn Frey and J.D. Souther as Long Branch Penny Whistle only had 1, so we were twice as good as they were. So, and I got to play acoustic guitar in the session, Jimmy Bowen producing, and I was between Al Casey on my right, and Al was the guy, the acoustic guitar player from the Wrecking Crew that played on all the records, and on my other side, on my left side was Glenn Campbell. And here I was, 19, 20 years old, and I got to play on this session with these guys, and it was a pretty amazing experience for me. The movie wasn't hugely successful commercially. The soundtrack was very cool, and I think the movie became very influential as kind of one of those movies that ushered in a new era of great American film. And as a matter of fact, I got an email yesterday from Jim Ridley, who's the editor of the Nashville Scene and a fantastic writer, great writer. I just can't wait for him to write a book, because he's such a fabulous film critic and a smart man. And he said that Vanishing Point is screening at the Belcourt Theater in Nashville, which is our kind of art house, independent film house, and he wanted to interview me for an article about Vanishing Point. So that movie has suddenly gotten all of this energy around it. And I ran into J.D. Souther about a month ago, and he was out to lunch with a mutual friend, and I walked up to him and I said, hey, weren't you in Long Branch Penny Whistle? And he said, fuck you! And then we went on to talk about Vanishing Point, and he didn't even have a copy of the recordings from that, but he said he really wanted to get one, so I put him together with the guy who has a digital copy of the soundtrack, another guy who was involved in the soundtrack album. And so it's interesting. I ran into Barry Newman at a tennis club in Los Angeles. This had to be 20 years ago. And I said, Barry Newman, Vanishing Point. And he went, oh yeah. And he walked right by me. And I said, so I called after him. I said, I had 2 songs in that movie. And he went, yeah, sure. So evidently that's not a treasured part of his memory or something. I don't know. You got to star in a feature film. I think that's a pretty cool thing. I know I was happy to be involved. We still get royalty checks from that movie, you know, performance rights money from BMI, and it's a blessing to have little things. You know, I've done more than a dozen feature films, and you know, it all kind of mounts up to something. It buys groceries every once in a while. So.
What other films were you involved in?
Oh, a lot of really bad ones. My biggest claim to fame is Staying Alive, which was the sequel to Saturday Night Fever, which sold a lot of records, and I produced and co-wrote the basically a big production number in the musical within the musical, and I got a Grammy nomination for that. So, and it sold about 8 million units, so worldwide. Still get money, still dribbles in from that, and that was in 1983, and we had our Grammy nomination was for '84. We lost to Footloose that year, so it was like the best album from a motion picture or musical or television special, that sort of thing. But to me, to have been nominated for a Grammy for Staying Alive as a songwriter, that's a pretty cool thing.
Oh, nice. And sorry, did you?
I was gonna ask. Bob tells a story about how the name the Wackers came to be. So I think it was between you two. So I'd love to hear your side of it, since we've heard Bob's side, I think, a couple of times at this point.
Well, he keeps talking about this name that we came up with in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., Ernie and the Incredible Chickens. And I don't remember that, but I do remember the name, and that was one that we laughed about quite a bit. But from my recollection, in the early 70s, there were a lot of kind of extremely pretentious art rock bands around. There was King Crimson and Gentle Giant and Genesis and Yes, and you know, everybody's name was kind of this cosmic sort of statement. And so I think we really, as a band that was really dedicated to doing short, tightly structured, melodic power pop songs, that we just wanted to go against the grain. And so we took what was in essence the Liverpudlian slang for friend, and that was what the Wackers was. You know, it means in Liverpudlian slang friend. So we're basically the friends.
I never knew that.
And it also had, of course, you know, an implication of masturbation and sexuality. So that was even more delightful for us, that we were friends who masturbated together, you know. And it's not too far from the truth, other than the fact that we usually kept our pants on.
When did you first meet Bob?
I met Bob when I was in high school. Bob used to come up to Portland in a band called the Family Tree, and I was probably a sophomore in high school when I first met him. And I really idolized Bob. He and the Family Tree, Cooch was in the Family Tree as well, and they were signed to RCA, and they wrote great songs, and they had such style. I mean, they seemed to be always on the cutting edge of the style of the times, and just one of the best bands I ever saw when I was in high school. So I became a really devoted fan, and I introduced myself to Bob at one point in time. And I remember I was doing two things. I was a folk singer, derivative of the early days of the 60s, folk revival of the 60s, and I also had a rock band, a couple of rock bands and garage bands in the Portland, Oregon area. And one night I went to see a Family Tree show, and I said, you know, I'm playing at this club called Folk Singers after the show, you know, and I'm doing a little set, and I'd love it if you guys drop by. And Bob and Cooch came, and they saw me play, and it made me really nervous because it was Bob Segarini and Cooch, you know. And so I played my little set, and afterwards we visited for a while, and Bob gave me his address and his phone number in Stockton. So we, you know, subsequent to that, my band, the Thundering Herd, opened for the Family Tree at the Crystal Ballroom, which was the pinnacle of my local music career, to not only play that venue, but to open for the Family Tree. And that what happened to be right at the time when Sgt. Pepper was getting released, and so there was quite a momentous evening where David Crosby from the Byrds and Paul Kantner from Jefferson Airplane played us the reel-to-reel master of Sgt. Pepper before it ever came out. And so it was just a really strong bonding memory that we had. And then when I went to college, I was at Oberlin in Ohio, studying music composition and acting, and the Family Trees record Miss Butters came out, which was truly, as far as I know, the first rock opera or rock operetta, along with, well, on the heels of Sgt. Pepper, but really, you know, keeping to the idea of making this be a consistent character all the way through in the development of a linear story, you know, about that person from youth to maturity and beyond. And that was before Tommy came out, which was very similar in terms of its arc. And so I wrote a little review, a review / fan letter to Bob at the address that he had given me at the gig there that night. And about, I guess, probably a year later, I had left college and I was making a little record of my own in Portland, and I got a call from Bob. He had called my parents because that's the return address and phone number I put on the letter, and he said, hey man, I'm putting together a new band and we're looking for a bass player and wondering if you're interested. And I didn't have to think twice. I just said, yeah. And I kind of backed out on promises I made to my parents, to my best friend. Ran away with the rock and roll circus with Bob Segarini. Met him in Stockton, California. Slept in a closet that, you know, was like one of those sliding doors. You know, it was a double wide closet, and on a, you know, bunch of blankets that were just thrown on the floor. Subsequently, I found out that Harry Nilsson had slept in that very same closet when he was writing with Bob for the Miss Butters record. So I was in amongst the good vibes, let's put it that way.
That's really cool.
I'm liking the car interview. I think Rand should be in the car with me all the time telling me stories.
There you go.
And drive to work with me every day and tell me a story.
Got plenty of them.
Can you tell us about the road trip?
Well, we talked about that a little bit just a few minutes ago, but
I didn't hear it though.
It was just laden with trauma from beginning to end. We drove from Eureka to Boise, Idaho, where my father's Volkswagen dealership provided us with a brand new Volkswagen van, you know, which, as you probably know, has like about 40 horsepower, and, you know, for a pretty large vehicle with 3 rows of bench seats, you know. And first thing that happened is just as we crossed the border into Montana, Bob's wife Cheryl shifted from 4th gear into 2nd gear at about 60 miles an hour, and the transmission just dropped onto the pavement. So we ended up crawling into some city, I don't know whether it was Missoula or, you know, some city in Montana. We had to spend the night until we could have a new transmission put in this brand new Volkswagen. So then we drive east, and as we're going, I think it's Interstate 80, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it's Interstate 80. And it was getting colder and colder and colder. And we're starting to hear on the radio that this is in the Midwest, this is the coldest winter in 50 or 60 years, and that the temperature is down in double digits below zero, and the wind chill factor is down like 40 and 50 below zero. And so we're driving along in this Volkswagen, and Volkswagens don't have good climate control, or didn't at that point in time. The heater only fed off of the engine. It was just getting heat off of the cylinders of the engine. It didn't have an independent way of blowing hot air. So here we are driving, and it's getting colder and colder and colder, and the windshield is icing over, and the only heat that we can really use is through the defroster, throwing hot air onto the windshield so we can actually see the highway. And somewhere along the line, Cooch says, you know what? I have some relatives somewhere in Wisconsin, and I bet we could stop there and warm up. So, somehow he makes contact with these people. He's got an uncle or a cousin, or a cousin in this little town called Hurley. And we get there, and we are like on the verge of frostbite and just shivering because we are so cold in this Volkswagen. The Volkswagen is looking like an iceberg, that's crawling along the highway. So we go to Cooch's cousin's place, and immediately he decides to go into his stash and pull out some homemade whiskey that he's made. So that's where it all starts, the debauchery of the evening. And so we empty this one bottle of homemade whiskey. By then we got a good buzz on. And he says, you want to go down to Toddy's Bar, which is another cousin's place down on the main drag, which is like 2 taverns and a hardware store, And we say, yeah, why not, because we were warmed up and well lubed by then. So we go down to one place, and we have a few shots down there. And then he says, well, let's go down the street to this other place. So we go down the street to this other place. We walk in, and this is like as hardcore northern Midwestern American bar full of, classically masculine men and equally masculine women. And we walk in there, and here I am in a pair of platform boots that are this high, and I am lit up on whiskey, and I've got a little residual eyeliner and mascara on my eyes and long flowing blonde hair, and I'm standing in there, and I make eye contact with this guy across the bar, and it's packed full of people, and he starts weaving his way, and as he comes closer, I can see this look in his eyes it's very unsettling to me. And he's got this stringy long hair and just this insane look in his eyes, and he comes up to me and he just goes, boom! Clocks me across the left side of my cheek. And I feel this tooth coming loose in my mouth. I spit it onto the floor, and I'm enraged. I'm drunk, I'm enraged, and I literally, instead of going, oh, I say, why did you do that? And he says, I don't like the way you look. And I said, well, I don't particularly like the way you look either, but I'm not going to walk across the room. And by then, he had taken his other fist and pummeled the other side of my face. So by then I was just seeing red, and so I took a swing at him. Well, that's where my big mistake was, because they dragged me out. He and his buddies dragged me out onto the sidewalk. Oh, no, and before that, between being hit in the face, I said to Bob, I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, Bob, this guy just hit me in the face. And he looks at me and he goes, are you sure? As if I would have hallucinated being slugged in the face and having a tooth come loose in my mouth. Are you sure? Such a friend he was. So they dragged me out on the sidewalk, and I kept trying to get up, but the sidewalk was solid ice, and I had these platform boots on. So I'm slipping and falling on the ground, and this guy is kicking me with these hobnail boots up my sides, on my head. So Mike Stahl finds out that here I am out on the sidewalk bleeding and being beaten to death on the sidewalk, and he comes out just enraged. And Mike was a big guy. He was a big guy, and he was used to being in bar fights and stuff. But the cronies of this guy who was beating me up were holding Mike back, and, you know, and it was slick and it was hard to get any footing. So finally the bartender came out and broke the fight up. In the meantime, I was laying on the sidewalk, and there was my head in a puddle of blood. So next morning I woke up not only with a severe hangover, but a concussion, a serious concussion, and bruises and broken nose and bruises all over my face. So we decided to leave town as quickly as possible, although I discovered that my wallet was missing. And so I said to Cooch and his cousin, you know, somebody stole my wallet. We certainly cannot cross the border into Canada, because that's where we're going, to Montreal, without me having ID, you know. So Cooch's cousin went right out, and within 30 minutes he'd retrieved my wallet. He knew exactly which goon in town had my stuff. Of course, all of my money was gone, but, you know, at least I got my ID and whatever I had in my wallet back. So we got on the road, and we're driving into what is the coldest winter in 50 or 60 years. We make our way from Wisconsin into northern Michigan, and driving up with the intention of going through customs in a really kind of rural place. And we're driving on 2 lanes of highway, and we are the only vehicle. Aside from our road crew, there are 2 vehicles on the road. That's it. It's so cold, and this fine snow is blowing all around. You can't see anything. It's just this whiteout everywhere. And suddenly, the Gull, which is what we called our Volkswagen van at that point, just went, came to a stop. Wouldn't start, no heat, what there was of heat anyway. We're sitting there in 40 to 50 degree wind chill in the middle of a 2-lane highway. So we send the road crew ahead to Marquette, Michigan, 90 miles ahead, to get a tow truck. And we're sitting in this thing, it was me and Melanie, Bob, Cheryl, Ernie, and his girlfriend Paula. We're sitting, and Cooch had gone ahead with the road crew to Marquette. And we are just trembling, you know, just chilled to the bone as far as you can possibly get. So Ernie decides, and I've got a fever of about possibly 104 or 105 from the trauma to my head. And Ernie decides, well, we've got some sterno, let's burn that, see if we can heat it up. Well, Volkswagens are airtight. I mean, you can actually drive a Volkswagen bus, even though it doesn't look like it. You could drive it into a lake and it would float. And so here we are burning sterno in the back of this, you know, with our hands over it, you know, and the heat is dissipating immediately. But the fumes from the sterno, however, are not dissipating. They're going up my nose. You know, here I am already delirious from the fever and the trauma to my head. And so I get out and I start running around the van, trying to clear my lungs of this horrible thing and to warm myself up. And Melanie comes out to get me, and she says, well, now that I got up, I have to pee. So she got Paula, and they went to pee behind a bush. Well, as soon as they got behind this bush, they saw a light. And they went, wow, we didn't see that before. Well, let's go see what that's all about. They found a farmhouse next to the road. So I've gone back into the van. The sterno fumes have dissipated to a certain degree, and we are all in there just shivering our asses off. Suddenly we realize that Paula and Melanie have been missing for about 10 or 15 minutes. We better go look for them and find out what happened. Maybe they got ate by a bear or something, you know. So we go, what's this? This farmhouse is there. And we all walk up to the farmhouse like little urchins, you know, and we look through the window, and there is Melanie and Paula with steamy hot cups of something in their hands, you know, laughing with this little lady who looks like Mrs. Santa Claus. And we rap on the door, and little Miss Santa Claus comes waddling down the hallway with this, you know, florid apron on, and she opens the door and she goes, "What took you boys so long?" You know. So Cheryl and Ernie and Bob and I go into this house, and I tell her that I'm not feeling well, and I think I have a temperature. And she takes my temperature, and it's about 104, and she goes into her medicine cabinet to find whatever she has, and all she has is Dristan, which is cold, was a kind of a popular decongestant back in those days. She gives me a couple of Dristan and wraps me up in blankets on the couch. It happened to be the day of Super Bowl III, so it was a Sunday, and we sat on the couch, and she made us tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, and we watched the football game. The Dristan brought my temperature down to almost near normal, and 2 or 3 hours later, the road crew showed up with a tow truck, and they towed the van into Marquette. We rented a car there and moved on. Subsequently, we got to Norm's